She fell in love with my struggle, not my success. Section 1. We loved each other before anything worked. The radiator in our first apartment didn't just hiss, it screamed, a metallic, desperate sound that echoed the state of my bank account in those early years. We lived on the third floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood that smelled perpetually of damp concrete and cheap exhaust. But back then, the air felt electric because we were breathing it together. I remember looking at Olivia across a card table we used for dinner, watching her stir a bowl of instant noodles with a kind of grace that felt entirely misplaced in that room. She would reach across the table, touch my hand, and tell me that she believed in the version of me that didn't exist yet, the man I was killing myself to become. It was a beautiful, dangerous form of devotion because it was rooted in our shared scarcity, a bond forged in the trenches of survival where every small win felt like a miracle. I stayed silent during those dinners because I was afraid if I spoke, I would admit how much the struggle actually hurt me. Success was a ghost I was chasing through 80-hour work weeks and cold morning commutes, while Olivia remained the only person who saw the bruises on my ego. There was a specific kind of intimacy in our poverty, a way she would lean her head on my shoulder when the electricity bill was overdue, whispering that we were a team. I realized much later that she didn't just love me, she loved the role she played in my survival, the indispensable anchor in a storm that I was desperately trying to escape. Jonathan Pierce, my mentor at the time, once told me that some people are built for the climb but aren't equipped for the summit, a warning I dismissed as corporate cynicism. I thought our love was the foundation, but I failed to see that for Olivia, the struggle wasn't a phase to be endured. It was the very identity of our relationship. That was the moment I understood that while I was building a ladder to get us out, she was decorating the pit we were standing in. By the second year, the first signs of my momentum started to manifest as small, meaningful shifts in our reality. Yet Olivia's reactions were strangely muted. I came home one evening with a modest bonus, enough to finally take her to a restaurant where the menus had no prices, and I expected a celebration of our joint endurance. Instead, she looked at the check with a lingering shadow of resentment, asking if this meant we were becoming those people who forgot where they came from. I watched her eyes flicker toward the window, avoiding my gaze, as if my progress was a personal affront to the quiet, struggling life she had mastered. It was the first time I felt a cold draft in a room with closed windows, a realization that my ambition was starting to create a distance that no amount of money could bridge. I stayed silent because I didn't want to believe that my success was becoming a threat to the woman who had promised to be my partner in achieving it. Ethan Caldwell entered our lives during this period of transition, a man who seemed to carry the very scent of the struggle I was so eager to leave behind. He was a creative who lived in a loft that was more drafty than ours had ever been, and he looked at Olivia with a sympathetic intensity that I no longer had time to provide. He would listen to her complaints about the corporate machine and my increasing absence with a nodding, performative empathy that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. I began to notice how her phone would buzz late at night, the screen illuminating her face with a soft blue glow that she would quickly turn away whenever I entered the room. The psychological pressure began to mount, not from the weight of my workload, but from the realization that my growth was being used as evidence against me in a trial I didn't know I was attending. Was it possible that she preferred the version of me that was failing because that version was easier to control and much more comfortable to pity? The silence between us started to grow, a thick, heavy curtain that fell every time I mentioned a new milestone or a potential promotion at the firm. I would watch Olivia and Ethan talk at gatherings, their voices low and urgent, discussing things like authenticity and the soul of the city, while I stood nearby in a tailored suit that felt like a suit of armor. I realized that Ethan wasn't a threat because of his status or his wealth, but because he offered her a return to the struggle she missed, a chance to be the hero of a tragic story again. I stayed silent during their long conversations, observing the way she leaned toward him, her body language screaming a betrayal that her words hadn't yet dared to utter. The power dynamic was shifting. I was winning the war of the world, but I was losing the territory of my own heart to a man who had nothing to offer but a shared sense of stagnation. I found myself wondering if she was waiting for me to fail just so she could feel close to me again, a thought that felt like a slow-burning poison in my vein. Section 2. Success Changes. What people compete for. The promotion to senior associate didn't come with a celebration. It came with a quiet, devastating realization that my office had become more of a home than our apartment. I sat in my new leather chair, looking out at the skyline of a city that was finally starting to acknowledge my existence, and felt a profound sense of isolation. When I told Olivia the news, she didn't hug me. She simply asked if this meant I'd be home even less, her voice flat and devoid of the spark that used to ignite when we talked about our future. I stayed silent because the truth was that I wanted to be home less, not because of the work, but because of the way she looked at me, as if I were a stranger who had stolen her husband's name. I realized that success doesn't just change the person who achieves it, it changes the people who are forced to witness the gap between their own reality and the new one being created. The competition wasn't about who could earn more, but who could remain pure in a world that rewarded the very things she now claimed to despise. I started seeing the subtle shifts in her behavior as a series of calculated withdrawals, a slow-motion exit from the life we had spent 5 years building. She began spending more time with Rachel Kim, a woman whose entire personality was built on a foundation of intellectualized misery and a disdain for anything that resembled traditional success. Rachel would whisper in Olivia's ear about how I was changing, how my ambition was a mask for a lack of depth, and Olivia would nod along as if receiving a divine revelation. I stayed silent because I was observing a pattern, a psychological realignment where my hard work was being recontextualized as a betrayal of our true selves. The pressure in the house became stifling, a constant unspoken accusation that every dollar I earned was a brick in a wall I was building between us. I began to understand that when you climb a mountain, the people at the bottom don't always cheer. Sometimes they just wait for you to slip so they can tell you they knew you didn't belong up there. Ethan Caldwell became a permanent fixture in the background of our lives, a shadow that Olivia seemed to gravitate toward whenever my light got too bright. At a dinner party hosted by Lauren Hayes, I watched from across the room as Ethan handed Olivia a glass of cheap wine, his fingers lingering on hers just a second too long. They were laughing at a joke I didn't hear, but I could feel the frequency of their connection, a shared vibration of us against the world that used to belong to me. I realized that Ethan was providing her with the one thing my success couldn't buy, the feeling of being needed by someone who was still figuring it out. He admired her struggle because it mirrored his own, while my progress only served to highlight the things she felt she was losing in the transition to a better life. I stayed silent, sipping a drink that cost more than Ethan's shoes, and felt a cold, analytical clarity wash over me as I watched my wife fall in love with a man who represented everything I had fought to escape. The internal monologue in my head became a constant loop of strategy and observation, a way to detach from the emotional pain of seeing her drift away. I stayed silent because I knew that confrontation would only make me the villain in her narrative, the cold, successful man who didn't understand her emotional needs. Instead, I watched the way she tucked her phone under her pillow at night, the way she checked her reflection in the mirror before leaving for coffee with friends who always seemed to include Ethan. I realized that betrayal isn't always a single, explosive event. It's a series of small, quiet choices that eventually add up to a different life. The social imbalance was becoming undeniable. I was moving in circles where influence and competence were the currency, while she was retreating into a world where victimhood and struggle were the highest forms of social capital. I felt the distance between us growing into a canyon, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to build a bridge across it. One evening, I returned home later than usual to find the apartment smelling of a brand of cigarettes that neither of us smoked. The cheap, unfiltered kind Ethan favored. Olivia was sitting on the sofa, her eyes slightly red, claiming she had just been thinking about the old days and how much simpler things were when we had nothing. I realized then that she wasn't just nostalgic, she was mourning the version of me she could feel superior to, the man who needed her to survive. I stayed silent as she spoke, my mind already calculating the next moves in a game she didn't even realize we were playing. I looked around at the expensive furniture and the art on the walls, things she had picked out but now seemed to treat as symbols of her imprisonment. The psychological pressure reached a new peak when she asked me, with a voice full of feigned innocence, if I ever regretted becoming this person. I didn't answer her immediately. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the blueprint of a betrayal that was already half constructed. I began to notice that my success was creating a new kind of leverage, one that I hadn't intended to use but was becoming increasingly necessary for my own protection. Jonathan Pierce had warned me that in the world of high-stakes business, your personal life is either your greatest asset or your biggest liability, and I was starting to see which one Olivia had become. I stayed silent when I found a discarded receipt for a bar across town where Ethan performed his poetry, a place she had no business being on a Tuesday afternoon. I realized that she wasn't even trying to hide it well anymore, perhaps because she wanted me to catch her, to give her a reason to finally leave and play the martyr. The realization that she was sabotaging our life to justify her own dissatisfaction was a bitter pill, but it gave me a strange, cold sense of dominance. I was the one with the power to change our reality, yet I chose to wait, to observe, and to let the consequences of her choices unfold with the slow, agonizing precision of a clock. The section ended with a quiet dinner where the only sound was the clinking of silverware against porcelain, a noise that felt as sharp as a razor. Olivia looked at me, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance, and asked if I was ever going to say anything about the way things had changed between us. I set my fork down, looked her directly in the eye, and felt a wave of calm that seemed to unsettle her more than an argument ever could. I realized that by not reacting, I was taking away the only power she had left, the power to make me feel small in my own success. I stayed silent for a long moment, letting the tension fill the room until it was almost breathable, before finally speaking a single sentence that I knew would keep her awake for the rest of the night. It wasn't an accusation or a plea, but a simple observation of a truth she thought she was hiding. I looked at the wedding ring on her finger, then back at her face, and asked a question that changed the air in the room. Section 3. I noticed who needed me to stay small. The question I asked her that night was simple. When did you decide that my growth was your loss? She didn't answer, but the way her hand trembled as she reached for her wineglass told me everything I needed to know. I realized in that moment of silence that some people don't want to see you reach the top because they're afraid they won't have a place there, or worse, that they'll be exposed as someone who only felt significant by comparison to your failure. I stayed silent because watching her struggle for an answer was more illuminating than any lie she could have manufactured. The psychological pressure in the room wasn't coming from my anger, but from my total lack of it. I was observing her with the same detached precision I used to analyze a failing merger at the office. I understood then that my greatest weapon wasn't my bank account or my title, but my refusal to play the role of the wounded husband. In the weeks that followed, I began to see the world through a lens of cold utility, noticing how people like Rachel Kim and Ethan Caldwell fed Olivia's sense of victimhood like they were stoking a fire. They needed her to believe that my success was a moral failing because it validated their own lack of movement in a world that was passing them by. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far they would go to convince her that she was trapped in a life that most people would kill for. I watched as she started dressing down, wearing the worn-out clothes from her early years as if they were a costume of a life she missed, a silent protest against the comfort I provided. It was a bizarre form of social regression, a calculated effort to align herself with Ethan's performative poverty while still enjoying the security of my health insurance and my roof. I realized that the betrayal wasn't just to defy the man I had become to justify the man she was seeing behind my back. I began to record the discrepancies in her stories, not out of a desire for revenge, but because I needed to ensure my own reality wasn't being gaslit by her increasingly erratic behavior. She would tell me she was at a gallery opening with Rachel, but I would see a charge on our joint credit card for a dive bar in a part of town she used to call dangerous. I stayed silent because every lie she told was a piece of evidence that confirmed my new position of power. I knew the truth, and she knew I knew, yet we both continued to dance around the inevitable. The internal monologue in my head became a sanctuary of logic, a place where I could process the rising psychological pressure without letting it crack my exterior. I realized that she was waiting for me to explode, to yell, to give her the toxic behavior she needed to justify running into Ethan's arms permanently. By remaining calm, I was effectively starving her of the conflict she required to feel like the hero of her own tragic romance. The social dynamics at my firm continued to accelerate, bringing me into contact with people like Lauren Hayes, who saw my professional trajectory as something to be admired, not apologized for. Lauren represented a world where ambition was the baseline, not a betrayal, and the contrast between her energy and Olivia's growing resentment was becoming impossible to ignore. I stayed silent during our professional dinners, but I was hyper-aware of how much easier life was when you weren't constantly being asked to shrink yourself to make someone else feel tall. I realized that Olivia's need for me to stay small was a reflection of her own fear of being irrelevant in the world I was now inhabiting. The pressure of maintaining two different versions of myself, the high-powered architect of my own future and the apologetic husband of a woman who hated my success, was becoming unsustainable. I began to wonder if the imbalance she complained about was actually just her inability to keep up with the pace of a life that demanded anger-less. One afternoon, I came home early and found her laptop open on the kitchen counter, a series of messages from Ethan flashing on the screen with the persistence of a heartbeat. He was telling her that she deserved to be truly seen, that her husband's world was a gilded cage, and that he was the only one who understood her artistic soul. I stayed silent as I read the words, feeling a strange sense of pity for both of them. For him, because he was using a script as old as time, and for her, because she was actually falling for it. I realized that Ethan wasn't looking for a partner, he was looking for a patron, someone who could validate his mediocrity while he saved her from the burden of my success. The power shift was becoming invisible, but absolute. I held the keys to the cage she claimed to hate, and she was too afraid to realize that once the cage was gone, she would have to face the world with nothing but Ethan's empty promises. I closed the laptop and walked away, never mentioning what I had seen, letting the weight of her secret become her own psychological prison. The final realization of that month came during a corporate gala where I was the guest of honor, and Olivia stood by my side like a ghost at a feast. She looked beautiful, but she was vibrating with a silent, radioactive hostility that made the people around us uncomfortable, a subtle sabotage of my professional standing. I stayed silent as she made small, cutting remarks about the excess of the evening, watching as my colleagues exchanged confused glances behind her back. I realized that she was no longer just an observer of my life. She was an active antagonist, someone who was willing to burn down the house we built just to feel the heat. The psychological pressure had reached a point where the next move had to be mine, but it wouldn't be the one she expected. I leaned in and whispered something in her ear that made her blood run cold, a question that hinted I knew more about Ethan than I had ever let on. I didn't wait for her to respond, leaving her standing alone in the middle of a crowded room, wondering exactly when the final. Section 4. Betrayal grows. Where admiration used to be. The silence in our car on the ride home from the gala was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating layer of unspoken truths that felt like it might shatter the windows. Olivia stared out the side glass, her reflection a pale, shimmering mask of the woman I used to know, while I focused on the road with a calm that felt almost predatory. I realized that admiration is a fragile currency. Once it's replaced by resentment, there is no exchange rate that can bring it back to its original value. I stayed silent because I knew that she was waiting for me to demand an explanation for her behavior at the event. but I refused to give her the satisfaction of an audience. The psychological pressure was now firmly on her side of the seat, a mounting realization that her subtle rebellion was being met with a wall of total indifference. I began to understand that when you no longer need someone's approval, you gain a level of dominance that no argument can ever achieve. Over the next few days, I watched as the betrayal began to grow in the cracks of our daily routine, a fungus that thrived in the dark, quiet spaces I left for it. She started taking long walks in the evening, returning with her hair slightly wind-blown and a look of dazed, romantic intensity that she couldn't quite hide from my analytical gaze. I stayed silent as I tracked the location of her phone from my office, watching the little blue dot hover over Ethan's neighborhood for hours at a time. I realized that she thought she was being clever, that she was playing a game of emotional chess where she was 3 moves ahead of her work-obsessed husband. In reality, I was the one who owned the board, the pieces, and the table they were sitting on, but I wasn't ready to end the game just yet. The internal monologue in my head was a cold script of if-then statements, preparing for every possible outcome of her inevitable confession or my eventual reveal. The imbalance of our relationship was now a gaping wound, but I found that I was the only one who wasn't bleeding out. I was the surgeon, and she was the patient who didn't know she was on the table. I began to intentionally provide her with more freedom, staying at the office even later and taking weekend business trips that I didn't actually need to attend. I stayed silent as she thanked me for understanding her need for space, her voice dripping with a false sincerity that made my skin crawl with a detached kind of amusement. I realized that by giving her the rope to hang our marriage, I was also giving myself the time to untangle my assets and secure my professional reputation from her impending exit. The rising psychological pressure was a tool I used to sharpen my own focus, a way to turn the pain of her betrayal into the fuel for my final ascent. I was no longer building a life for us. I was building a fortress for myself, and she was slowly being moved outside the walls. Ethan Caldwell's presence in her life was no longer a shadow. It was a loud, clashing noise that she was starting to bring into our home through phone calls she thought I couldn't hear. I stayed silent as I listened to her whisper to him from the bathroom, her voice filled with a desperate, youthful longing that she had never shown me even in our best years. I realized that she wasn't in love with Ethan. She was in love with the idea of being the muse of a struggling artist, a role that required her to be the victim of my success. The status threat he posed was non-existent in the real world, but in the twisted hierarchy of her mind, his poverty made him morally superior to my competence. I watched as she started giving him gifts, items from our home, small amounts of cash, as if she were paying a tax for the guilt of living a comfortable life. The psychological dominance I held was rooted in my patience, my ability to watch her destroy her own dignity while I remained perfectly, tested fine. One evening, I invited Jonathan Pierce over for dinner, a calculated move to show Olivia exactly what her future would look like if she chose to stay, and what she would lose if she left. Jonathan spoke about our upcoming international expansion, the millions in play, and the legacy we were building, his voice a steady drumbeat of power and inevitability. I stayed silent as I watched Olivia's face go through a series of complex emotions, greed, regret, and a sudden, sharp fear that she was making a catastrophic mistake. I realized that she wanted the status of my world, but the soul of Ethan's, a contradiction that was tearing her apart from the inside out. The pressure reached a breaking point when Jonathan asked her a direct question about our plans for the following year, and she could only stutter a vague, meaningless answer. I looked at her with a calm, expectant smile, letting the silence stretch until she was forced to look away, humiliated by her own lack of substance in a room beat of power. As the night ended and the house fell quiet again, I went to my study and began the final preparations for a shift in our dynamic that would be permanent. I stayed silent as she entered the room, her eyes wet with tears that I knew were more about her own confusion than any genuine remorse for her actions. She started to speak, to offer a half-hearted apology for her behavior at dinner, but I held up a hand to stop her, the gesture as sharp as a command. I realized that the time for talking was over and the time for consequence had arrived, but not in the way she was expecting from the old Matthew. I looked at her for a long time, the silence growing until it felt like a physical barrier between us, before I finally reached into my desk and pulled out a single unmarked envelope. I didn't hand it to her, I just placed it on the desk and told her that her choices had finally caught up with her timeline. Section 5. I stopped explaining my ambition. The envelope sat on the mahogany desk like a dormant explosive, its silence more deafening than any scream she could have mustered in that moment. Olivia's eyes darted from the paper to my face, searching for a flicker of the man who used to beg for her approval, but she found only a stranger with a steady gaze. I realized that my silence was the most terrifying thing I had ever offered her because it signaled the end of my desire to be understood by someone who refused to see me. I stayed silent as she reached for it, her fingers hovering over the edge, a physical manifestation that had defined our marriage for the last 12 months. The psychological pressure was no longer a weight I carried, it was a weapon I had refined, and the room felt colder as she realized she was no longer the one holding the leverage. That was the moment I understood that true power isn't about having the last word, but about being the first one to stop caring if the other person hears it. I watched her open the envelope, not to find divorce papers or an angry letter, but a series of high-resolution photographs of her and Ethan at the dive bar, their intimacy captured with clinical indifference. There was no shouting, no dramatic reveal of my broken heart, only the quiet wrestle of paper as she flipped through the evidence of her own betrayal. I stayed silent as the color drained from her face, watching the way her posture collapsed when she realized that my work-obsessed absence had actually been a period of intense, focused observation. I realized that she had mistaken my restraint for ignorance, a fatal error in judgment that people often make when they assume that ambition and emotional intelligence are mutually exclusive. The internal monologue in my head was a calm, steady rhythm, noting her reaction as if I were reviewing a balance sheet that had finally been reconciled after years of being out of sync. I felt a profound sense of relief, not because the May hard or strength of time. Success had given me the resources to hire the best, and the clarity of those images was a testament to the fact that I didn't do anything halfway, including the dismantling of a lie. I stayed silent as she began to stammer an explanation, her voice thin and reeking of the desperation that comes when a person's carefully constructed victimhood is exposed as a fraud. She tried to tell me that Ethan meant nothing, that it was just a reaction to my coldness, using the same tired script she had rehearsed with Rachel Kim for months. I realized that she was still trying to make me the architect of her infidelity, a move so predictable that it almost made me smile if the situation hadn't been so pathetic. The rising psychological pressure was now an invisible hand around her throat, the pressure of her own guilt meeting the vacuum of my lack of interest in her excuses. I began to understand that the greatest humiliation you can inflict on a betrayer is to show them that their betrayal didn't actually break you. It just bored you. The days following the reveal were marked by a new, chilling efficiency in our household, a routine where I treated her with the polite distance of a temporary tenant. I stayed silent during breakfast, reading the financial news while she sat across from me, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking as she tried to navigate a reality where her struggle was no longer a valid currency. I realized that she was waiting for me to kick her out, to create a scene that she could use to garner sympathy from Ethan and the rest of her authentic friends. I refused to give her that exit, choosing instead to let her live in the house I paid for, surrounded by the success she despised, while I moved my life into a different gear entirely. The status threat had evaporated. She was no longer a partner, but a liability I was managing with the same cold competence I used to handle a bad investment. I watched her look at the luxury around her with a new kind of horror, realizing that the gilded cage was the only thing standing between her and a life of genuine, unromanticized joy. I began to spend more time with Lauren Hayes, not for romance, but for the sheer intellectual refreshment of being around someone who didn't view my drive as a character flaw. Lauren understood that the cost of success wasn't something to be lamented, but a price paid for the freedom to move through the world on your own terms. I stayed silent when Olivia asked where I was going in the evenings, my lack of an answer, a powerful reminder that she had forfeited the right to my transparency. I realized that by stopping the explanations, I was reclaiming the parts of myself I had given away in the hopes of being enough for someone who preferred me when I was less. The psychological dominance was absolute. She was living in my world, by my rules, and she was discovering that the struggle she loved so much was a very different beast when you didn't have a successful man to subsidize it. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I watched her try to reach Ethan, only to realize that he was no longer the rebel wife, but just another woman in trums. One evening, I found her sitting in the dark of our living room, the city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows I had worked a decade to afford. She asked me if I ever loved her, her voice a small, broken thing that fluttered in the vastness of the room like a trapped bird. I stayed silent for a long time, not out of cruelty, but because I was searching for a version of the truth that wouldn't feel like a waste of breath. I realized that the woman I loved was a projection I had created to keep me going during the hard years, a ghost that had never actually inhabited the body of the person sitting in front of me. I looked at her and felt a strange, detached kind of pity, the way one feels for a person who has set their own house on fire and is now complaining about the smoke. I finally spoke, my voice a calm, low vibration that seemed to fill the entire apartment with the weight of an inevitable conclusion. Section 6. Achievement creates emotional distance. The words I spoke to her weren't an answer to her question, but a directive for the future. Pack only what you brought into the first apartment, the rest belongs to the life you claim to hate. I stayed silent as she looked around at the designer furniture, the art, and the life of comfort she had spent the last year undermining with her resentment. I realized that the ultimate consequence of her betrayal wasn't going to be a loud argument or a legal battle, but a return to the authenticity she had so loudly championed. The psychological pressure shifted from the betrayal itself to the terrifying reality of its aftermath, the realization that Ethan's loft had no heat, no security, and no room for her entitlement. I began to understand that achievement doesn't just create distance, it creates a standard that, once lost, feels like an amputation to those who never truly earned their place within it. I watched as she realized that her moral victory was about to be met with a very realistic, very cold financial defeat. The process of her leaving was a slow, methodical removal of a presence that had already become a shadow, a cleaning of the slate that I approached with the same focus as a major project. I stayed silent as she packed small boxes, her movements sluggish and heavy, as if she were waiting for me to change my mind or offer a compromise. I realized that she was still hoping for a save, a moment where I would break character and show the emotional vulnerability she could use to re-enter my life. I refused to be the hero of her drama, remaining a spectator in my own home, a man who had already moved on to the next phase of his existence before she had even crossed the threshold. The internal monologue in my head was occupied with the logistical efficiency of my new freedom, the way my time and energy would now be directed toward things that yielded a return on investment. I felt a rising sense of psychological power as I realized that by not reacting to her departure, I was effectively making it permanent. I began to notice how the social circle we had shared started to fracture, with people like Rachel Kim suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere when the reality of Olivia's situation became clear. I stayed silent when Lauren Hayes mentioned that the rumors were circulating, her tone suggesting that she knew exactly what had happened and respected the way I had handled it. I realized that in my world, competence is a form of currency that buys you the benefit of the doubt, while Olivia's world of feelings offered no such protection when the money ran out. The emotional distance I had cultivated was a shield that protected my reputation and my peace, a barrier that she could no longer penetrate with her tears or her accusations. I began to understand that success is the best defense against a betrayal because it provides you with the options that the betrayer has systematically destroyed for themselves. I looked at the vacancy she was leaving in my life and saw not a hole, but a space for something more suggesting. The status threat from Ethan Caldwell had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet professional satisfaction as I watched his creative life continue to stagnate from a distance. I stayed silent when I heard that he had started complaining to anyone who would listen about how I had destroyed Olivia's spirit, a narrative that only served to make him look small and bitter. I realized that by not engaging with him, I had made him irrelevant, a footnote in a story that was now moving into much grander territory. The psychological pressure was now entirely on the two of them, a pair of struggling souls who were about to find out exactly how much struggle they could actually handle without my bank account to soften the blow. I felt a cold, restrained sense of dominance as I realized that the most devastating thing I could do to them was to let them have exactly what they said they wanted. I was the one who had survived the struggle and conquered it, while they were the ones who had chosen to make it their permanent residence. One afternoon, I sat in my office and looked at a new set of blueprints, a project that was larger and more ambitious than anything I had ever attempted before. I stayed silent as my assistant brought in a cup of coffee, the quiet efficiency of the room a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had defined my home for so long. I realized that achievement isn't just about what you build, it's about what you're willing to leave behind to ensure the structure stays standing. The distance I had created wasn't just emotional, it was a physical and social boundary that separated the person I was from the people who wanted to keep me anchored to the past. I felt a surge of quiet, powerful energy, a realization that the betrayal had been the final catalyst I needed to become truly untouchable in my field. I was no longer a man who worked to provide a life for a partner. I was a man who worked because it was the highest expression of his own nature. As the final box was moved out of the apartment, Olivia stood by the door, looking at me with a mix of longing and a dawning terrible clarity about what she was losing. I stayed silent, standing by the window with my hands in my pockets, the city of my success spread out beneath me like a map I had finally mastered. She started to say something, a final parting shot or a plea for a different ending, but I simply checked my watch, a gesture that told her more than any words could about the value of my time. I realized that she was no longer a character in my story, but an extra who had overstayed her scene, and the realization was visible in the way she finally turned and walked away. The psychological dominance I felt in that moment was absolute, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I hadn't lost anything that was actually worth keeping. I watched the door close and felt the air in the room change, a question of what came next lingering in the silence like a promise. Section 7. She wanted access to what I became. The silence of the penthouse after her departure wasn't empty. It was pristine, a clean canvas where the noise of her resentment used to echo. 6 months passed, and my trajectory didn't just climb, it accelerated with a force that felt like a natural law, as if the weight I had dropped allowed me to reach terminal velocity. I stayed silent when I saw the headlines about the Pierce-Sloan merger, a deal that solidified my position as one of the youngest power players in the city's architectural skyline. I realized that the coldness she had accused me of was actually the very clarity required to operate at this level, a sharp, surgical focus that she mistook for a lack of soul. The psychological pressure was now completely external, a series of high-stakes negotiations and board meetings where my reputation for calm dominance preceded me into every room. I began to understand that the more you achieve, the more you become a target for those who walked away when the price of entry was too high. I started receiving accidental messages from Olivia, digital echoes of a woman who was finding the reality of Ethan's world to be far less romantic than the theory. She would send pictures of small things, a brand of coffee we used to drink, or a park we once walked through, thinly veiled attempts to bridge the canyon she had dug with her own hands. I stayed silent, deleting the messages without responding, because I knew that she wasn't missing me. She was missing the safety, the status, and the effortless comfort that my presence provided. I realized that her love for the struggle had a very short shelf life once the struggle became her actual everyday reality without a safety net to catch her. The internal monologue in my head was a cold calculation of her regret, a realization that she was now looking at my life from the outside, realizing she had traded a throne for a folding chair. I felt no joy in her suffering, only a profound, detached sense of justice that her choice route. The social imbalance was now so vast that we were effectively living in different centuries, a gap that was highlighted when I ran into Rachel Kim at a charity gala Lauren Hayes had organized. Rachel, who used to be the architect of Olivia's discontent, looked at me with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, her previous disdain replaced by a desperate desire to be associated with my success. I stayed silent as she tried to explain Olivia's situation, mentioning how things with Ethan were complicated, and how Olivia often spoke about how much she regretted our misunderstanding. I realized that even her friends were abandoning the narrative of my villainy now that it was clear I was the one who had won the war of relevance. The rising psychological pressure on their side of the fence was palpable, a frantic attempt to rewrite history so they could find a way back into the warmth of the fire I had built. I walked away from Rachel without a word, my lack of engagement a far more devastating response than any insult could have ever been. Ethan Caldwell's name appeared one last time in my periphery, not as a rival, but as a cautionary tale in a local arts column about lost potential and unpaid debts. I stayed silent as I read between the lines, seeing the pattern of a man who used women to fund a vision he lacked the discipline to actually execute. I realized that Olivia hadn't just betrayed me, she had betrayed herself by falling for a cliché that I had outgrown by the age of 24. The psychological dominance I felt was rooted in the fact that I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy them. I simply had to succeed, and the contrast between our lives did the work for me. I began to understand that achievement is the most efficient form of revenge because it requires no effort other than being your best self while the other person becomes their worst. I looked at the city through my office window, feeling a sense of quiet authority that didn't need a witness to be real. The final attempt at contact came in the form of a handwritten letter left with my building's concierge, a desperate, rambling plea for a civilized conversation over coffee. Olivia wrote about how she had been lost, how she had finally realized that I was the only one who truly understood her, and how she wanted to support me in my new ventures. I stayed silent as I read the words, noting the way she tried to frame her return as a gift to me, as if her presence was something I still required to feel complete. I realized that she wanted access to the man I had become, the version of me that was refined by the very fire she had tried to extinguish with her betrayal. The pressure she was feeling was the pressure of impending irrelevance, the fear of a woman who had realized too late that the person she discarded was the only one capable of carrying her weight. I placed the letter in the shredder, the soft hum of the machine, a final, mechanical goodbye to a ghost that no longer had a place in my home. As the year drew to a close, I hosted a small private dinner for my inner circle, including Jonathan Pierce and Lauren Hayes, people who had stood by me when the climb was at its steepest. I stayed silent for a moment before the first course was served, looking at the faces of individuals who valued competence, loyalty, and the quiet power of a shared vision. I realized that this was the life I had been building toward all along, a world where love was an alliance of equals rather than a parasitic dependence on a shared struggle. The psychological satisfaction was absolute, a moral clarity that came from knowing I had stayed true to my ambition while others had surrendered theirs for a temporary thrill. I looked at the empty chair where Olivia might have sat, and instead of a void, I saw a space for a future that wasn't burdened by the past. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, a realization that the story was finally ending on the only terms that ever truly mattered, mine. Section 8. What love looks like after you outgrow it. The final section of this journey began not with a bang, but with a peaceful early morning silence that felt like a permanent state of being. I sat on my balcony watching the sun rise over the skyline I helped design and realized that I didn't feel the need to look back, not even for a second. I stayed silent as I reflected on the last 2 years, the transition from a man who was defined by his struggle to a man who was defined by his mastery. I understood now that love, in its highest form, isn't about two people clinging to each other in a storm. It's about two people who have built their own ships and choose to sail together. The psychological pressure of the betrayal had completely evaporated, leaving behind a diamond-hard clarity about who I was and what I was capable of achieving without a weight around my neck. That was the moment I understood that the cost of my success wasn't the loss of Olivia. It was the price of my own freedom from a narrative that was beneath me. I saw Olivia one last time, purely by chance, in a crowded subway station as I was heading to a site visit, a rare departure from my usual car service. She looked older, the vibrant, defiant spark in her eyes replaced by a dull, permanent weariness that seemed to cling to her like the cheap fabric of her coat. I stayed silent as our eyes met for a fraction of a second, a moment of recognition that felt like a bridge collapsing into the sea between two different worlds. I realized that she saw exactly what she had thrown away: the tailored suit, the confident stride, the look of a man who was no longer fighting for a seat at the table because he owned the room. She didn't approach me, and I didn't stop, our paths crossing and diverging with a finality that was as cold and inevitable as the change of seasons. The internal monologue in my head was a single, quiet thought: I hope the struggle was everything you wanted it to be. The quiet power shift that had begun months ago was now an established reality, a social and professional dominance that felt as natural as breathing. I stayed silent when people asked me about my ex-wife, my lack of a detailed answer becoming a form of protection for a past that I no longer felt the need to defend or explain. I realized that by not speaking ill of her, I was maintaining a moral high ground that she could never hope to reach from the depths of her own regret. The rising psychological pressure had been replaced by a deep, resonant calm, the peace of a man who has passed through the fire and found himself to be indestructible. I began to understand that the true victory wasn't in winning the breakup, but in outgrowing the version of myself that would have cared about winning in the first place. Success hadn't just changed my lifestyle, it had changed my frequency, making the static of betrayal impossible to hear. Lauren Hayes became a more permanent fixture in my life, a partner whose ambition matched my own and whose support was rooted in a shared respect for the work we did. I stayed silent during our first evening together that wasn't about business, realizing that this was what I had been missing: a relationship where success was a shared language, not a source of resentment. I realized that I didn't need someone to love my struggle. I needed someone who could stand beside me in the light of the victory we were both working to sustain. The psychological dominance I felt was no longer directed at anyone else. It was a mastery of my own environment, a control over my time, my energy, and my heart. I felt a sense of restrained, dignified satisfaction as I realized that I had reached the summit and found that the air was perfectly breathable for those who belonged there. The consequences for Olivia and Ethan unfolded exactly as the laws of physics dictated. Without a foundation, their structure simply crumbled under the weight of reality. I stayed silent when I heard that Olivia had moved back in with her parents, the authentic life, with Ethan having ended in a predictable flurry of unpaid bills and mutual recriminations. I realized that her betrayal hadn't been an act of love for him, but an act of sabotage against me, a desperate attempt to bring me back down to a level where she felt she could compete. The final moral closure came not from a confrontation, but from the simple fact that I was still standing, stronger and more capable than ever, while she was forced to start over from the very bottom. I felt a quiet, professional pity for her, the kind you feel for a person who misread the blueprints and build a house on sand. But it was a pity that didn't require any action on my part. As the sun fully rose over the city, I turned back toward my apartment, my mind already moving toward the challenges of the new day. I stayed silent as I closed the door on the balcony, the click of the lock, a final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life that was now firmly closed. I realized that I was the architect of my own destiny, and that the people who fall in love with your struggle are often the same ones who will try to keep you there forever. The psychological pressure was gone, replaced by a sense of infinite possibility and the quiet, steady hum of a life well lived. I walked toward my desk, picked up my pen, and began to draw the lines of a future that was entirely my own. I felt a sense of profound, restrained victory, a realization that I hadn't just survived the betrayal. I had used it to build something that would last a lifetime. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.